Ironically, then, the world's regnant universalist, democratic, egalitarian faith is a particular or peculiar cult that has broken out along identifiable historical and geographical pathways with an epidemic virulence that is disguised as progressive global enlightenment. The route that it has taken through England and New England, Reformation and Revolution, is recorded by an accumulation of traits that provide abundant material for irony and for lower varieties of comedy. The unmasking of the modern liberal intellectual or open-minded media truth-teller as a pale, fervent, narrowly doctrinaire Puritan, recognizably descended from the species of witch-burning zealots, is reliably and irresistibly entertaining. Consider, for instance, the most famous words of America's Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. Could it be honestly maintained that to submit scrupulously and sincerely to such self-evident truths amounts to anything other than an act of religious reconfirmation or conversion? Or denied that, in these words, reason and evidence are explicitly set aside to make room for principles of faith? Could anything be less scientific than such a declaration, or more indifferent to the criteria of genuinely universal reasoning? How could anybody who was not already a believer be expected to consent to such assumptions?
That the founding statement of the Democratic Republican Creed should be formulated as a statement of pure and doctrinally recognizable faith is information of sorts, but it is not yet irony. The irony begins with the fact that among the elites of today's cathedral, these words of the Declaration of Independence, as well as many others, would be found almost universally to be quaintly suggestive at best, perhaps vaguely embarrassing, and most certainly incapable of supporting literal assent. Even amongst libertarian slanted conservatives, a firm commitment to natural rights is unlikely to proceed confidently and emphatically to their divine origination. For modern liberals, believers in the rights-bestowing or entitlement state, such archaic ideas are not only absurdly dated, but positively obstructive. For that reason, they are associated less with revered predecessors than with the retarded fundamentalist thinking of political enemies. Sophisticates of the cathedral core understand, as Hegel did, that God is no more than deep government apprehended by infants, and is such a waste of faith that bureaucrats could put to better use. Since the cathedral has ascended to global supremacy, it no longer has need for founding fathers who awkwardly recall its parochial ancestry and impede its transnational public relations. Rather, it seeks perpetual reinvigoration through their denigration. The phenomenon of the new atheism, with its transparent progressive affiliations, attest abundantly to this. Paleo-Puritanism must be derided in order for Neo-Puritanism to flourish.
There is no part of Singapore, Hong Kong, Taipei, Shanghai, or very many other East Asian cities where it is impossible to wander safely late at night. Women, whether young or old, on their own or with small children, can be comfortably oblivious to the details of space and time, at least insofar as the threat of assault is concerned. Whilst this might not be quite sufficient to define a civilized society, it comes extremely close. It is certainly necessary to any such definition. The contrary case is barbarism. These lucky cities of the western Pacific Rim are typified by geographical locations and demographic profiles that conspicuously echo the embarrassingly well-behaved model minorities of Occidental countries. They are, non-obnoxiously, dominated by populations that, due to biological heredity, deep cultural traditions, or some inextricable entanglement of the two, find polite, prudent, and pacific social interactions comparatively effortless and worthy of continuous reinforcement. They are also, importantly, open, cosmopolitan societies, remarkably devoid of chauvinistic boorishness or paranoid ethno-nationalist sentiment. Their citizens are disinclined to emphasize their own virtues. On the contrary, they will typically be modest about their individual and collective attributes and achievements, abnormally sensitive to their failures and shortcomings, and constantly alert to opportunities for improvement. Complacency is almost as rare as delinquency. In these cities, an entire and massively consequential dimension of social terror is simply absent. In much of the Western world, in stark contrast, barbarism has been normalized. It is considered simply obvious that cities have bad areas that are not merely impoverished, but lethally menacing to outsiders and residents alike. Visitors are warned to stay away, whilst locals do their best to transform their homes into fortresses, avoid venturing onto the streets after dark, and, especially if young and male, turn to criminal gangs for protection, which further degrades the security of everybody else. Predators control public space. Parks are death traps. Aggressive menace is celebrated as attitude. Property acquisitions for mugs or muggers. Educational aspiration is ridiculed. And non-criminal business activity is despised as a violation of cultural norms. Every significant mechanism of socio-cultural pressure, from interpreted heritage and peer influences to political rhetoric and economic incentives, is aligned to the deepening of complacent depravity and the ruthless extirpation of every impulse to self-improvement. Quite clearly, these are places where civilization has fundamentally collapsed, and a society that includes them has to some substantial extent failed.
Within the most influential countries of the English-speaking world, the disintegration of urban civilization has profoundly shaped the structure and development of cities. In many cases, the natural pattern in which intensive urbanization and corresponding real estate values are greatest in the downtown core has been shattered, or at least deeply deformed. Social disintegration of the urban center has driven an exodus of the even moderately prosperous to suburban and exurban refugees, producing a grotesque and historically unprecedented pattern of donut-style development, with cities tolerating or merely accommodating themselves to ruined and rotting interiors where sane people fear to tread. Inner city has come to mean almost exactly the opposite of what an undistorted course of urban development would produce. This is the geographical expression of a Western, and especially American, social problem that is at once basically unmentionable and visible from outer space. Surprisingly, the core-crashed donut syndrome has a notably insensitive yet commonly accepted name, which captures it in broad outlines, at least according to its secondary characteristics, and to a reasonable degree of statistical approximation: white flight. This is an arresting term for a variety of reasons. It is stamped first of all by the racial bipolarity that, as a vital archaism, resonates with America's chronic social crisis at a number of levels. Whilst superficially outdated in an age of many-hued multicultural and immigration issues, it reverts to the undead code inherited from slavery and segregation, perpetually identified with Faulkner's words: "The past is not dead, it isn't even past." Yet even in this untypical moment of racial candor, blackness is elided and implicitly disconnected from agency. It is denoted only by illusion, as a residue, concentrated passively and derivatively by the sifting function of a highly adrenalized white panic. What cannot be said is indicated even as it is unmentioned. A distinctive silence accompanies the broken half-expression of a mute tide of racial separatism, driven by civilizationally disabling terrors and animosities, whose depths and structures of reciprocity remain unavowable. What the Puritan exodus from Old to New World was to the foundation of Anglophone global modernity, white flight is to its fraying and dissolution. As with the pre-founding migration, what gives white flight ineluctable relevance here is its sub-political character. All exit and no voice. It is the subtle, non-argumentative, non-demanding other of social democracy in its dreams. The spontaneous impulse of dark enlightenment as it is initially glimpsed at once disillusioning and implacable.
That American whites and blacks, considered crudely as statistical aggregates, coexist in a relation of reciprocal fear and perceived victimization is attested by the manifest patterns of urban development and navigation, school choice, gun ownership, policing and incarceration, and just about every other expression of revealed preference that is related to voluntary social distribution and security. An objective balance of terror reigns, erased from visibility by complementary, yet incompatible perspectives of victimological supremacism and denial. Yet between the liberal and conservative positions on race, there is no balance whatsoever, but something closer to a rout. Conservatives are utterly terrified of the issue, whilst for liberals it is a garden of earthly delight, whose pleasures transcend the limits of human understanding. When any political discussion firmly and clearly arrives at the topic of race, liberalism wins. That is the fundamental law of ideological effectiveness in the shadow, fragrant shade of the cathedral. In certain respects, this dynamic political imbalance is even the primary phenomenon under consideration. The regular, excruciating, soul-crushing humiliation of conservatism on the race issue should come as no surprise to anybody. After all, the principal role of conservatism in modern politics is to be humiliated. That is what a perpetual loyal opposition or court jester is for. The essential character of liberalism, as guardian and proponent of neo-Puritan spiritual truth, invests it with supreme mastery over the dialectic, or invulnerability to contradiction. That which it is impossible to think must necessarily be embraced through faith. Consider only the fundamental doctrine or first article of the liberal creed, as promulgated through every public discussion, academic articulation, and legislative initiative relevant to the topic. Race doesn't exist, except as a social construct employed by one race to exploit and oppress another. Merely to entertain it is to shudder before the awesome majesty of the absolute, where everything is simultaneously its precise opposite, and reason evaporates ecstatically at the brink of the sublime. If the world was built out of ideology, this story would already be over, or at least predictably programmed.